As Eurozone nations sink ever deeper into crisis, the UK Treasury now is working on a contingency plan for the single currency's collapse, if it does happen. It includes capital control measures that under EU rules require agreement from most of the Union members. Now, Britain's also prepared, it says, to close its borders and evacuate expats and holidaymakers from the affected countries, if the worst was to happen. Robert Ould, president of the Bruges Group of Campaigners Against Excess Unification in Europe, I'm sure has got something to say about that. Robert, very good to see you tonight. So what are the chief dangers that the UK is trying to protect itself from in case of the Euro's breakup that I've been talking about there?
Well, one of the main things that the British Treasury is concerned about is that as the euro collapses, the value of the pound would increase in value, which would harm British exports. Now, really, of course, the Treasury is mainly focusing on problems caused by the collapsing euro rather than the benefit. So really it's looking at things round the wrong way. There would be benefits to many nations if the Eurozone did indeed collapse, or was at least wound up in an orderly fashion.
OK, but there's no sign of that happening at the moment, is there?
Well, the European leaders are trying to shore up the Eurozone by having greater degrees of centralisation and having countries like France and Germany have the final say, in a sense, over the budgets of those EU member states that have excessive budget deficits. But that really isn't the answer to the problems. What's really needed is either a massive injection of cash into countries like Greece and Italy to shore up their economies. That would be money that would have to be transferred from France and Germany and other nations which have better budget situations than the Mediterranean Rim nations, which are struggling. And of course even more money from the European Central Bank, even more than has been given already. So we're talking in the trillions of euros. That's one option. Of course, another option would, of course, to recognise that the single currency has hurt competitiveness in many Rim nations of the Eurozone and has damaged economic growth, meaning that the economies can't grow their way out of the debt crisis that they're in, and they're just in this debt spiral and having deeper austerity measures forced upon them, which then means they still cannot pay back the money that's owed to various financial institutions around the globe, particularly French and German banks. So really there's a number of options, either to transfer funds from the north to the struggling south, or of course have an orderly breakup of the Eurozone. OK, now we know your general view on this, and no one's arguing it's always good to have a B plan, an emergency plan if the worst should happen, but I guess the UK also needs to look how it's getting on with its European neighbours. It has already vetoed that fiscal union plan proposed by Eurocrats. It didn't go down well in all quarters. What is Britain doing now by talking about this new emergency plan? Isn't it just deepening the rift, making the problem worse for itself? Well, Britain really didn't veto an actual EU treaty. There wasn't an actual treaty at that point proposed. There wasn't even a draft established. David Cameron was arguing that he would sign up to or agree to a future discussions on a possible treaty if there was a move away from qualified majority voting to having a national veto over the EU having regulations over financial services. That was rejected actually by Sarkozy. It was Sarkozy that in a sense wielded a veto, and it was later criticised, David Cameron was later criticised by the President of the European Commission. Really what Britain needs to be doing is to recognise that the euro is a mistake, and of course they're in a sense coming up with a plan which would be trying to offset any dangers of there being a euro breakup, but really there needs to be recognition that there would be benefits. There would be economic growth eventually restored in other nations. But
one of the big dangers, of course, all that money on risk from Britain's top banks. They've got tens of billions of pounds exposed in the weaker euro economies in the form of loans, etc. What's likely to happen to those if the worst were to happen? Does this plan kind of address that in any way?
Well, the plan doesn't really recognise that the banks would, of course, have problems. There would be, if there were to be a major default, if the currencies of the euro were to collapse, then, of course, there would be less money going into those banks. But, of course, the other assets, other financial assets would rise. And there could also be, if there were to be a breakup of the euro, then, of course, the German currency would rise in value, and so if there were to be 2 euros in a sense, there would be a southern euro which would be of a lower value, where those countries could then gain competitiveness. That would then mean there would be economic growth restored, and the euro for, say, countries like Germany the Netherlands, Finland would increase in value. So really there's benefits, and of course there are also disadvantages. The British government's report recognises the disadvantages but doesn't do enough to analyse the benefits of there being a breakup of the euro. There would of course be a shock, but things would be eventually returning to economic growth. There would be benefits as well.
Robert Olds, thanks for your thoughts. Director of the Bruges Group campaigning against further EU unification. They're joining us from London. Thank you.